Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event on moral capitalism and the Democratic Party with our special guest, Professor Michael Kazin of Georgetown University. Our program this evening is the fifth and final of a fall term series of programs at St. Olaf College on the topic of capitalism, freedom, and community. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm a professor at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute sponsoring tonight's event and the fall series just mentioned. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and support free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing our event tonight, as always, very special thanks go to Institute staff, to the St. Olaf Broadcast and Media Services crew, to St. Olaf Marketing and Communications, and to Justin Merritt of the Institute Directors Council. Finally, thanks to the St. Olaf College faculty and students who have integrated their study with our event this evening, particularly participants in the Public Affairs Conversation program supported by the Institute and courses in American history offered by the St. Olaf History Department. To remind our virtual audience members, you are invited to submit a question at any point during the discussion this evening by using the Participate tab on the streaming page. We are honored to have with us tonight as our guest Michael Kazin, who is professor of history at Georgetown University and editor emeritus of Dissent magazine. He's the author of 6 books and the editor of 3. His most recent book, War Against War, The American Fight for Peace, 1914 to 1918, published in January 2017, won the Best Book Prize from the Peace History Society. His other books include The Populist Persuasion, An American History, originally published in 1995 and revised publications in 1998 and 2017, and Barons of Labor, The San Francisco Building, Trades, and Union Power in the Progressive Era in 1987, which won the Herbert Gutman Prize. He's also editor-in-chief of the Princeton Encyclopedia of American Political History, published in 2010. A book that Michael has just completed is scheduled to be published in March of 2022 by Farage, Straus, and Giroux. The title of the book, What It Took to Win, A History of the Democratic Party. Michael is a former online columnist for the New Republic and has written articles and reviews for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, and many other periodicals and websites. He has held fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Institute for Advanced Study, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Smithsonian Institute, and the Fulbright Program, and has lectured widely in the United States, Europe, Russia, and Japan. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. There are other things that we might say about Michael Kazin's illustrious career, but for now, Michael, welcome. We're so pleased to have you with us this evening.
Well, thank you, Professor Santuri. It's wonderful to be here. I wish I could be with you all in person, but it's a great honor to be a speaker in this series, which I've heard a lot about. And thanks a lot for inviting me.
Glad to have you. Michael, again, our topic tonight is moral capitalism and the Democratic Party. Moral capitalism is a concept central to the book you are publishing next spring and to a number of articles you've published of late. Someone who was another guest of ours earlier this fall had a look at our fall program overall, saw the title of your event, and expressed eagerness to learn why moral capitalism is not an oxymoron or a contradiction in terms. The idea being, of course, that capitalism is in some sense a kind of amoral venture, and what do we mean by moral capitalism? Anyway, this concept of moral capitalism you adapt from the work of Elizabeth Cohen, an historian at Harvard. But what exactly do you mean by moral capitalism, and how does the concept figure in your history of the Democratic Party?
Yes, well, thanks. That is a central question in the book, certainly. By the way, just in case, here's a picture of the book. People are interested in seeing it at some point. What I mean by moral capitalism is a set of programs and a political appeal, which I think Democrats have made throughout their history in different ways, which combines an appreciation for the positive aspects of capitalism, the fact that entrepreneurs can develop industries, that there's a price system which helps to decide what people actually want to buy. But at the same time, Democrats have, especially when they've been a powerful party and have often dominated the political universe, they have tried to rein in capitalism, either by opposing monopolies and oligopolies in industry, which was really the phase of moral capitalism which was dominant in the Democratic Party in the 19th century, early 20th century, or by supporting workers' organizations, especially labor unions, which tried to bring workers, a greater share of the product they were producing. And it involves various kinds of legislation, from lowering tariffs to supporting government regulation of labor unions under the Wagner Act. In general terms, what I mean by moral capitalism is an acceptance of capitalism as a system that most Americans believe is a good system with all its faults, and yet a real attempt to make it a more decent system, a more ethical system, one that will, as much as possible, be regulated to serve the interests of the great majority of the people who, after all, throughout American history have been small farmers, small business people, or wage earners. So it's what sometimes has been called the liberal tradition in America. People like great historians like Richard Hofstadter and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote about it that way. But I think it's got a continuity, which I think many people who've looked at the history of the party have not recognized, between a figure like Andrew Jackson, for example, who's not much beloved now by Democrats, all the way up to figures like Lyndon Johnson and even Joe Biden. So I'm seeking to find a continuity in the ideology of the party, and I think that's what I try to trace through different eras and different individuals who have articulated a vision of moral capitalism.
Yeah. Let's say a little bit more about this Jacksonian tradition in American history and the history of the Democratic Party as you understand it. You see that in the presidency of Andrew Jackson, something that is picked up on by the Democratic Party finally and is held on to in a kind of central way. But there is another view out there that sees not the Democratic Party, but somebody like Donald Trump as the bearer of the Jacksonian legacies. So, for example, when he was president, Trump had a picture of Jackson hanging in his office and presented himself as a great admirer of Andrew Jackson. You might remember the debate about the $20 bill, and under Obama, the idea was that we were going to replace Jackson with Harriet Tubman. And when Trump became president, he says, well, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep Jackson on the bill, and so forth. And that he liked in Jackson the idea of American nationalism, the idea of America first, and no one's going to push us around, that kind of thing. So how do you take Andrew Jackson and cast him in a somewhat different light as a progenitor of principles and values that are at the heart now of the Democratic Party, in light of that competing interpretation of what Jackson was all about? Yeah.
Well, this would be one of the more controversial parts of my book for many people, I think. But Jackson, like most controversial figures, it was a complex character. On the one hand, he hated Native Americans with a passion and began the Trail of Tears, forced migration of Native Americans from the state of Georgia to what became Indian Territory. He was a great defender of slavery and wanted to expand slavery into the West, and supported the Mexican-American War, of course, what became the Mexican-American War. He died right before then. So he was not a figure that today I would admire. On the other hand, he was also a figure who was the center of the creation of the Democratic Party as a mass party, supporting universal white manhood suffrage when Federalists and others in the political universe were opposed to that. And also, he was a great believer in an economy which could help the the artisan and the small businessman, as long as they were white, and that's of course very important to underline, succeed. And the key battle to define moral capitalism in during his 8 years in office, I think, was the battle against the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States. Second Bank of the United States, without going into great detail about it, was a very powerful institution. It was chartered by Congress, and so it was a national institution, but it was run pretty much entirely by its board of directors, who were wealthy men who vested the money of the U.S. government where they thought it would do the most good. They were in favor of economic development, but they often gave money to their friends. They also created their own currency for a time. And Jackson believed that this was not just undemocratic, but it was a feature of a kind of elite economy, even an aristocratic control of the economy that he was very much opposed to. And so he decided to, when the Congress rechartered the Second Bank in the early 1830s. He vetoed that, and Congress could not override his veto. He said he said the bank wants to kill me, but I'm going to kill the bank. So in a symbolic way, as well as I think in a real way, he stood for a sort of small owner's economy and a capitalist economy, very clearly a capitalist economy, but one where small holders, small farmers, small business people, small banks for that matter, state banks, not national banks, could thrive. So it's this sort of opposition to concentrated power in the economy, which I think is a tradition which, for the Democratic Party at least, and for Americans more generally, he was a key figure in beginning of that tradition, a tradition that is still with us in many ways. And, on the other hand, of course, he used populist language, and populist language, I wrote a whole book about this called The Populist Persuasion. Populist language can be used both on the right and the left. So Bernie Sanders uses populist language to support the 99% against the 1%. Steve Bannon and his mentee, Donald Trump, praised Jackson because Jackson was the tribune, as they saw it, of the ordinary white working man who was opposed to elites on the top, but also clearly who had no respect whatsoever for dark-skinned people below. And so in some ways, you also have the beginning of a sort of two different traditions of populism in Jackson's time. One, which I think can be considered a tradition of left-wing populism, which tries to organize the great majority of Americans, regardless of race or gender for that matter, against a very small elite. But the more powerful kind of populism in the 19th century, at least, was Jacksonian populism, which argued for the sort of the great white middle against elites at the top and dark-skinned poor people at the bottom.
Yeah, I wonder if we could focus just a bit on the war on the bank that Jackson initiated. There was one quotation that sort of leapt out of the manuscript for me, and I wonder what you would say about it now. Here's your remark. But the great bank war, you said, Jackson's war against the Second Bank, would not be the last time a successful political strategy ignored or flouted sound thinking about the economy. Jackson's position on the Second Bank became one of his most significant legacies. It helped inspire later campaigns against the money power by figures like William Jennings Bryan, Wilson, Franklin D. Roosevelt, that led to the passage of such landmark measures on the Federal Reserve Act, the Progressive Income Tax, and the National Labor Relations Act. Beginning with the bank war, the Democrats gained an invaluable reputation as the People's Party and compelled their opponents to wrest the title away from them. Well, what leapt out to me was the idea that it wasn't sound economic thinking. So, what was your point there exactly? That there's a kind of ideology operative here, going after the big banks that has a political effect, but it's not really rooted in sound economics, or what? I was surprised by that characterization.
No, that's a great question. As we know, powerful political positions are often not ones that economists would endorse. That was true of supply side economics for most economists, which was, of course, the dominant economic thinking in Ronald Reagan's administration in the 1980s. And there's an argument to be made that the low tariff, for example, in the late 19th century, which was Democratic Party gospel. Democrats, and this is true for Jackson too, for the most part. Democrats believe that a high tariff to protect American industries only helped those people already helped the haves in the economic in the American economy, that they only help people who already could set up oil fields, steel mills, garment factories, and so forth. And the high tariff, of course, protected them from foreign competition and kept prices high for those goods. So it created a larger profits for those in business. But there's an argument to be made that the high tariff, was actually very good for American industry, as Whigs and then Republicans argued. At least for a time, as long as it is an argument to be made that it enabled America to become the industrial behemoth that it became, eventually taking over as the leading industrial economy in the world. So, as a historian, I wouldn't want to say that I could, have a learned debate with an economist about these issues, but I do think it's important to note that in politics, a powerful ideological position which appeals to the majority of the people, as majority of the voters at least, as the bank war did, as certain points in the late 19th, early 20th century, the low tariff position did, isn't necessarily one that, in retrospect, was good for the development of the economy. It's really, a matter of politics. And the point of writing this book was, of course, not to talk about whether, in retrospect, everything Democrats stood for was good for America in general. It's to figure out what was useful to them in winning elections, because that's the whole point of having a political party in the first place, is to win elections.
Interesting. Shift a little bit. You, generally speaking, you associate the interests of the working class, at least in contemporary times, with the Democratic Party. But what might you say about alternative accounts of class that see class divisions as cutting across party lines? One prominent exponent of this alternative view of class, I don't know if you know his work, is Michael Lind. In his book, The New...
Yeah, I've actually been on panels with Michael in the past, and we've talked about populism together a lot, actually.
Yeah, right. In that book, Lind argues that the principal class divisions do cut across party lines, that the class in control he labels the managerial elite. And by the managerial elite, he means people in high finance, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, executives of transnational corporations, Wall Street, but also the Washington, D.C. political class, Democrats as well as Republicans, the mainstream press, and then the academy, which is one of the elite's propaganda arms in his view. This managerial elite, in his account, is largely committed to globalization and the weakening of national boundaries and national identities, yet at the same time is invested in the identity politics of race, ethnicity, and gender. And he goes on to say that this managerial elite, again, it cuts across party lines. It includes Democrats like the Clintons, and even Obama, in his account, sidling up to Wall Street, and Republicans like the Bushes. And this managerial elite has promoted particular policies related to globalization, for example, open borders on immigration, that are detrimental to the domestic working class, in his account. So then whether I'm going on a bit here, indulge me just for a moment, whether authentically or not, according to this view, Trump spoke to and continues to speak to the working class, which has been left behind by the managerial elite. The working class, with some justification, protests against this. Trump's victory in 2016 and his continuing influence are the outcomes of this working class protest. Now, in your book, you recognize in a general sort of way, when you talk about the Reagan Democrats in the 80s, the way they abandoned the Democrats, Carter and Mondale and so forth. But in the book, in the section on Trump in the book, in the new book, the point about working class abandonment of the Democrats seems to get lost. At any rate, in this account, the Democratic Party hasn't represented the working class since the Clinton administration, or maybe even since Jimmy Carter. And Trumpist republicanism now speaks for the work. And again, abstracting from Trump's character and all that, Trumpist republicanism, now speaks for the working class against the managerial elite that have run both the Democratic and Republican parties, and so forth. And just to end this, yesterday's election might be a kind of demonstration of his thesis. The Republican Glenn Youngkin defeats Democratic Terry McAuliffe in Virginia, apparently capturing the working class votes. The populist parenting revolt against the teaching of critical race theory, and so forth. Anyway, how do you react to that alternative account of what the managerial elite is all about, who the people are, which party represents the people, and so forth?
Well, it's a vital question, I think, and a vital matter for Democrats to figure out, of course, if they're going to win again, and certainly if they're going to be able to become the majority party again, instead of one of two battling parties, neither one of which has majority. Historically, the Democrats were the party that had most white working class votes in the South, especially, of course, but also elsewhere. And Franklin D. Roosevelt would not have won 4 elections if he hadn't won working class votes. Really, up until the 1990s, if you were in the bottom half of the income level in America, you were much more likely to be a Democrat than a Republican. Now, that did begin to change in the 90s for complex reasons. Part of it, I think, was the salience of what we call the culture wars about issues like immigration, like abortion. It broke down along religious lines, as you know, as a theologian. People who went to church and go to church now on a weekly basis are much more likely to be Republicans if they're white again, not if they're African American. And certainly the Trump's popularity can be explained in different ways, I think, depending on what groups you're talking about. But certainly, Michael Lind is right that he did appeal to people who felt that white working class people who felt their status in America had declined drastically. They no longer were able to get the kind of good incomes they were. He didn't talk about unions very much because he's really not a supporter of unions. But those people used to have strong unions, and the Democrats, of course, used to work symbiotically with unions to support union growth, and the unions would back Democrats, which most of them, of course, still do. But the last chapter of my book is called "Cosmopolitans in Search of a New Majority," and the problem Democrats have, I think Michael Lind's right about this, is that they're perceived as Democrats are people like me, liberal to radical college professors who have rather complex ideas about how society works, who believe that there should be a more global society, who believe that it's a mistake to have not necessarily. I don't think very few Democrats want really open borders. That I think is erroneous. But obviously, Democrats want to be more open to immigrants, especially poor immigrants coming from south of the border, than most Republicans do. But I think where Michael errs, that kind of analysis errs, is by not understanding that, in fact, Republicans, and here's a political, point I'm making, I think, not just a historical one. I mean, Republicans are still very much the party of managers. The new governor of Virginia, for example, Glenn Youngkin, funded a lot of his campaign with lots and lots of money he made from his private equity business. And most people in business are still Republicans, and that includes people who are in the global elite. So there's a division, I think, between the cultural views of a lot of people in the white working class and when they support Republicans, who I think are people who are, in economic ways, not really doing anything serious to support the interests of those white working class people, except, one has to underline this, sharing a cultural position with people is supporting their interests. I think it's wrong to, as some Marxists used to do, and maybe still do, to see only economic interests as important interests. I think cultural interests are important interests. If you care about, if you support a ban on abortion, that's as important to you as the wages you earn or the kind of health care you get. Democrats are much better, of course, people like that, at getting them higher wages, at helping them get more health care. The whole welfare state that most Americans, one way or another, enjoy, though of course it's administered very unequally, is a welfare state that basically Democrats built with support from some liberal Republicans, but very few. And it's a welfare state that Republicans, when they get into power, try to tear down, as the Republicans didn't want to fund Medicaid in the states. They, of course, tried to kill Obamacare. And in the past, they've talked about making Social Security voluntary and so forth. So I think we have to look at this class question in a cultural way and also in an economic way. But I think Lynn is quite right that the power of Trumpism, if we call it that, which has taken over the Republican Party for the most part, is speaking to this sense of grievance. And that's what, of course, people who like the slogan, Make America Great Again, are talking about. That America used to be a country where white working class people and lower middle class people were much better off. I would argue the Republican Party program will not make them better off, probably make them worse off, but that's not the point. The point in politics is to make a persuasive case. And Glenn Youngkin made a more persuasive case than Terry McAuliffe did. And also, I should add about education, the very fact that the teachers union, both teachers unions, the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, are probably the strongest unions in America right now, represent a greater portion of their workforce than any other unions do. And the fact that, of course, they are there in the classrooms teaching in ways that conservatives often do not like, was a perfect foil for not just for the new governor of Virginia, but also for a lot of other Republicans who are probably going to run on a similar kind of message as Youngkin did in next year's election.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. In your account, and in your proposal to the Democratic Party about the kinds of strategies they ought to employ, you say time and time again, both in the book but also in articles that you've published on this topic recently, that class and economics ought to be central rather than race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation, identity, politics. Not to say that you say those things are excluded, but in some sense, they ought to have a diminished standing in democratic strategy. And I want to just read you a quotation from a piece of yours. I think it was in the came out in the New Republic, and I'd like you to comment on it. You say, "I'm an historian, not a political strategist, but a crusading demand for good jobs at good wages, affordable health care for everyone, racial equality, and a green infrastructure would combine four essential objectives a clear majority of Americans already support." And then you go on to say, let's see, shaping the party's image around such goals would not prevent left Democrats from advocating policies such as defunding the police and abolishing most limits on immigration that are more controversial than popular. But for now, their backers could not insist that the party unite behind them. I mean, that's a fairly substantial, controversial claim, I should think, and that would elicit certain kinds of reactions. I mean, could you comment a little bit on what that's all about, and maybe how it might relate to what happened yesterday in the election?
Sure. Well, as I said, I'm not a strategist. My son is. He's a Democratic strategist. But he's run Democratic campaigns, mostly successfully. But, you know, the point of a party, of course, as I said, is to win elections, to win a majority, and to win a durable majority, if at all possible. And the Democrats are a more heterogeneous coalition than the Republicans are. The Republicans are overwhelmingly white still, though they're getting more and more Latinas, and some Asian Americans on the side, still not that many African Americans, and not that many recent immigrants from developing countries. So it's easier for Republicans to, I think, unite to be a more disciplined party, if you will, the Democrats, because Democrats are more diverse, not just racially and ethnically and religiously, but also in terms of their points of view. But I think the most, as I said, I argue in the book and also in the article that came out soon after Biden was inaugurated, I argue that the best programs and the ones that help the most people are universal programs like Social Security, like Medicare, like Obamacare, like federal aid to education, which helps everybody. Like some of the ideas that the Democrats are straining with tremendous efforts to pass right now, the Build Back Better programs, pre-K kindergarten, pre-K for all school children, for example, expanded Medicare and Medicaid, covering Medicare covering dental care, perhaps, or eye care. Programs that are paid for with tax dollars. Though Democrats would like, of course, to have this much more progressive tax system, which also is very popular. These ideas are all very popular, by the way. They poll very, very well, including among a lot of Republicans, as well as independents and 95% of Democrats. And so I'm not arguing that, and it'd be impossible anyway, to tell people who disagree with that, oh, shut up and just accept party discipline. That's not going to happen. This is America. This is not the People's Republic of China. No Democratic Party can discipline its members. But I do think common sense would argue that it makes more sense to find programs that will appeal to a majority of people, that are far-reaching programs that really change things for the better for most Americans, but that don't appeal to people primarily on a racial basis, for example, that don't require white people to accept the whole program of Black Lives Matter, or to support some more radical conceptions of transgender rights. Someone who's a left winger and a radical in the 1960s, when I was in college, I saw the beginnings and the evolution of those cultural movements on the left, and I support their aims, in an ultimate sense. But wanting to change the culture is a long, slow process, and I think with issues like climate change, with issues like the yawning gap between the rich and the poor, and the rich and everybody else in the society, the way to get Democrats into power on a regular basis is to promote, stand for, and if at all possible, enact programs which will help the great majority. That just seems like common sense to me, both because these programs are popular and also because they will make a big difference for the great majority. There's a wonderful book that's a bestseller for a while by a woman named Heather McGhee, a Black intellectual and an activist as well, head of the Demos Foundation, very powerful and group that works on voting rights, called the Sum of Us. I don't know if people out there might know the book. And she basically argues that the way to argue for racial equality and for racial justice is to argue that those who oppose it oppose lots of changes in society that white people need too, like stronger labor unions, like more progressive taxation, like a much broader safety net for children as well as for adults. And by dividing white from Black, Republicans have, since the 1960s, I think, succeeded in diminishing the power of what might be a more united working class. It's never going to be the working class the way Marxists would like it to be. That's a myth that has ever existed or could ever exist. But certainly, working people could be more united around these programs. So that's my argument. And I realize that people read the book and some people disagree with it, perhaps vociferously. But the point here is not what one would like to have. The point is what kind of strategy and program one could put forth, which can actually win elections and change people's lives. And that would not include, for example, reparations for individual African Americans.
All right, but by implication, what you say suggests that you take issue with people who argue that the fundamental problems in American society have to do with things like systemic racism and that sort of thing. That has to be those sorts of concerns.
I mean, as an historian, I think that is a fundamental problem. But the question is how you solve it, what you do about it. And to me, what you do about it is putting forth programs which help Black people, who are actually poorer than white people, more in some ways than you help white people. But if you are talking about racism and in effect telling white people who you want to be on your side that you really have to, think about racial justice first and foremost. That's the key issue. We can't really foreground anything else. Then you're going to get a backlash. You already have a backlash to some degree based on that, and you're going to lose politically. And winning. Obviously, the title of my book is "What It Took to Win." Winning. If you don't win elections and you don't have state power, you're not going to change people's lives in a major way. You're not going to do it by having people sit around and talk about racism, as important that can be. But that in itself is not going to do away with racism.
Getting back to yesterday, would you say that what happened
yesterday, right?
Yeah. Would you say that what happened to the Democratic Party, or seems to have happened to the Democratic Party yesterday, was a function of the party's failing to follow the kinds of prescriptions that you are articulating in these articles and in your book?
Well, any one election, especially just a state election, can be, read in different kind of ways. Look, the Democrats have been fumbling a lot in the last 4 or 5 months. They put forth this bill, the Build Back Better, budget, and also they got, with some Republican support, infrastructure bill passed through the Senate, but haven't voted on it in the House. But all the media reports have been, moderates are battling with progressives. Oh my God, what's Joe Manchin going to do? What's Kristen Sinema going to do? And so people who voted for Biden, or even people who didn't, expected, well, as a new president, let's give him, some time to change things, feel like the Democrats haven't really done anything. And of course, people are still wearing masks, to work. In many workplaces, like my workplace, I wear a mask to teach, as probably folks do in St. Olaf's as well. And inflation has gone up. So, I think to the degree that you can say there were national reasons why Terry McAuliffe lost, and why the race in New Jersey for governor was closer than it was expected to be by the polls, though it looks like the Democrat will actually eke it out. But is because Biden won. People who voted for him had a lot of hopes in what he might be able to do, but those hopes were in many ways naive, because not just because of bickering in the party, but because the bickering in the party takes place at a time when Democrats promise to do great things, but they have a margin of 1 vote in the Senate, right, and about 4 votes or 5 votes in the House, and is never in American history ever before happened that a party has been able to carry out a pretty far-reaching program with such a narrow majority in both houses. And so, in that sense, I blame Biden for all kinds of things, and I blame the Democrats for all kinds of things. But structurally, they're in a very tough place, really. And so, I think the larger questions are out there. But look, if the Build Back Better thing had passed, and the infrastructure bill had passed, and Biden and other Democrats were talking about all it would do for people, and the polls show that those individual parts of it are quite popular. Let me say that again. That in polling shows across the board that way more than half of Americans support the different parts of that program when they hear about them. Then things might have been different. But of course, counterfactuals are not good history.
Sure. There is a lot of anxiety, of course, now about inflation. How about that? Do you see inflation as a working class issue?
Sure. If you have to drive for a living, if you drive long distances, then you have to pay $1 more a gallon for gas, and your income is $20,000, $25,000, $30,000, $35,000. That's a big deal. And you can't afford an electric car. You have to keep driving your gas guzzler. So no, it's a real problem. And that's, by the way, a problem. I don't know if this is going off on a tangent. It's part of the problem with the politics of climate change too, which is in the past, and this goes to what Democrats have been successful. In the past, Democrats could campaign not just as the party of more moral capitalism, but also a party that was a party that produced growth in the economy. But of course, if you're going to, and I hope we're going to make a transition to renewable energy, that renewable energy at first at least might be more expensive than fossil fuels. And not many people have electric cars. Not many people have solar-powered houses or businesses, for example. And so retrofitting all that is going to be very expensive. And in the short run, at least, it's going to be harder on people who have less, and that's a serious problem. It's not a surprise that China, India, Pakistan, countries in Latin America are dragging their feet on making important investments in renewable energy. It's because their people have been poor much more recently. A majority have been poor, and they obviously want to be better off, have more comfortable lives.
Yeah, I was thinking in part the issue of inflation against big spending packages too. I mean, is it a working class?
Yeah, though I think people forget the $3.5 trillion bill, which now will be a $1.9 trillion bill. That's over 10 years, and it sounds like a lot of money altogether, but in fact. If you believe economists like Paul Krugman, who of course is a Democratic economist, the program could pay for itself by funding, jobs to work in solar energy and wind energy, by hiring more people, to teach pre-K, hopefully at better wages than pre-K teachers get now. So. And of course, this is a battle between Keynesian economics and more conservative economic theories. And of course, Democrats, ever since the 1930s, have been very much believers in Keynesian economics. And I think without, if Keynes is wrong about the economy, then the Democratic programs fall apart. But I think I could argue, without being an economist, that Keynesian economics produced, the greatest growth spurt in American history from the 1940s up until the early 1970s.
Okay, shift topics a little bit. Thanks, Michael. You got a chapter in the book coming out that focuses on women in the Democratic Party. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about women in the Democratic Party in the period that you talk about in that one chapter, or for that matter, more generally, women's issues and so forth. Yeah. Well.
This chapter was kind of, I knew a lot about the history of the Democratic Party before I started reading the book, but I didn't know about most of the things I read about in the chapter. It's called "It's Up to the Women," this chapter title, and it's the title of a book by Eleanor Roosevelt, who, before she was First Lady, was part of a network, a vigorous network, in many ways influential network of female reformers who I think were in many ways proto-New Dealers. They supported a higher minimum wage. They supported the labor unions for men and for women. They supported a more progressive income tax. They supported various measures to help children, like, for example, a national child care program. And they worked together. Some of them supported the campaign of Al Smith for president in 1928, the first major party nominee who was a Catholic. And was a very progressive governor of New York in the 1920s. And they really, I think, helped to define a species of moral capitalism which was very alert to the problems of women, to the problems of children, and to the problems of the worst off workers in American society, garment workers, migrant workers, which include, of course, a lot of women as well as men. I think this was really, and also this women's network represented a change from the history of Democrats in terms of women, which was, I think more conservative, if you will, troglodyte, you might even say, than the Republicans had been. Republicans supported women's suffrage in general before Democrats did. Republicans supported the prohibition of alcohol, which was a very important issue for a lot of women reformers in the late 19th, early 20th century. And Democrats with a largely immigrant, white working class, and often Catholic, Eastern Orthodox constituency in the cities opposed prohibition very strenuously. And also, Republicans, of course, were the party of abolition, the party which had led the war against the slave South, and the Democrats were, which a lot of women were involved in the abolitionist movement, and a lot of Democrats were, let us say, even Northern Democrats, much more ambivalent about abolition, and they opposed it until it became part of the Constitution in 1865. But there was a gradual change, I think, in the views of Democrats, in part because Democrats became more solicitous of the interests of immigrants in the cities, more solicitous of the interests of women as well as male immigrants, did support women's suffrage by a couple of years before the amendment was ratified to give all women the vote. And so this group of women, this women's network in the Democratic Party, which included Eleanor Roosevelt and other people like Belle Moskowitz, people may not have heard of, Frances Perkins, who became the first female cabinet member during the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt, and she was Secretary of Labor. And it's not coincidental, the first woman cabinet member was Secretary of Labor, because she'd been involved in labor affairs for a long time before Roosevelt was elected. So this women's network then really, I think, changed the both perception of the Democratic Party as less involved in women's issues and more hostile to feminism than the Republicans were. And also, I think, began a process where by the 1960s, Democrats were much more supportive of the new feminist movement. Democrats were much more supportive of the Equal Rights Amendment. And Democrats were, by the 60s at least, and Democrats, of course, also supported much more pro-choice rather than pro-life on the issue of abortion. So I think the beginning of that change was in the 1920s. So that's why I think it's a fascinating part of, I hope, a fascinating part of the book. I shouldn't praise myself, but I think there's a way in which it's something I discovered I didn't really know before. I think will come as a surprise to a lot of people, how important women were in the party, women leaders were in the party, really right after women get the vote.
It's a very interesting chapter. And a very interesting ending, and I would like you to comment on the quotation from Eleanor Roosevelt that you lift in the chapter. You say, "In It's Up to the Women," that's the title of her book, of course, Eleanor Roosevelt argued against the notion that Americans of her gender thought about politics in the same ways as the men who wielded state power. And here's the quote that sort of stuck with me. She looked forward to, quote, "a social order built by the ability and brains of our men that would also represent the understanding heart of the women." I'm wondering if you could give us an exegesis of that text.
Sure. Well, I'm sorry Eleanor was not here to do it herself. But as a lot of people know, by the way, while she was First Lady, she was seen as the sort of moral heart of the administration in many ways, speaking directly to people, going out to the country, talking to families in trouble, unemployed workers, supporting civil rights for African Americans in a way that her husband didn't feel he could do, or he'd lose the white South, which of course he needed to be elected and also to pass a lot of his programs. People who know about the history of feminism know that there's sort of feminist scholars often identify two different kinds of feminism. Equality feminism, where women basically want to be treated, not the same as men, but basically all the same rights as men, not be seen as somehow different or having different interests. Everyone's a citizen together. Everyone wants life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. You shouldn't have to carve out, a separate set of programs necessarily for women, a set of separate appeals for women. Whereas Roosevelt was part of a different strain of feminism that now goes by the name of difference feminism. Back then, people talked about it, sort of maternalist feminism, you might say. And this was a very important part of the suffrage movement, I should say, too, that Republicans spoke to as well as Democrats in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century. The idea that women are the most moral part of society, that they bring up the children, they educate the children, they teach the children about religion. And so politics should be a kind of a form of what feminists call social housekeeping. Social housekeeping. Let's put the house in order, make it a healthy place to live the way housewives do in the home. And the book, It's Up to the Women, was full of recipes. It was full of ways to tell unemployed people and poor people generally in the Great Depression. It came out right in the early part of the Great Depression. How you can stretch your dollar, various recipes that aren't very, I should say, appetizing today, a lot of creamy dishes, for example, without much spices, but so it's I think indicative of her point of view about feminism, about the place of women in the party too, that she spoke, she wrote a book that had lines like the one you quoted, but it also had recipes in it. It also told people how to run a better house, a better home, I should say.
Fascinating, fascinating. I think, thanks, Michael. I think now might be a good time to go to general Q&A, receiving questions now from the audience. Some submitted ahead of time based on reading some of your stuff in the classes that I mentioned earlier, some coming through the live feed. This one from Brent Sykes, St. Olaf class of 2024. Would there be such a thing as the Democratic Party as we know it, had it not been for their desire to uphold slavery and other discriminatory beliefs?
Well, it's a counterfactual, of course, which historians are told not to do because we don't know. I mean, slavery, of course, began in this country and was an important part of the economic and cultural system of this country before there was a Democratic Party. And as I point out in the book, the Democratic Party was an alliance between slaveholders and ordinary whites without slaves, but slave owners like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Andrew Jackson, James Monroe. The early Democratic presidents were all slave owners who were from the South and certainly wanted to uphold that system, with people in the North who were able to say, well, we can work with slave owners. We don't want slaves ourselves, but they supported slavery. This is, artisans in the cities, small farmers who didn't want slavery abolished because they were afraid if slavery was abolished, then enslaved people would come north and compete with them. But there's no getting around the fact that the Democratic Party was a racist party at its core in the beginning of the party. But to say that's all it was doesn't, I think, explain why a lot of people who were important in the Democratic Party become Republicans in the 1850s because they oppose what they think is the growing power of what they call the slave power. Whether or not they supported the abolition of slavery, they thought that with the Mexican War, with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which basically deputized police and even individuals all over the country to help slave owners get back their quote property in humanity when they escaped from slavery. There was a real shift, I think, among a lot of Democrats to think that their support for their alliance with slave owners had been a mistake. But Brent is certainly right that the Democratic Party was the party that did uphold slavery more than its opponent at the time, the Whig Party. The Whigs were split about this. I mean, a lot of big slave owners were Whigs as well. But Alexander Stephens, who becomes vice president of the Confederacy, was a Whig, for example. But Jefferson Davis was a Democrat. So it was a coalition of its own kind. But I think to say that is to say that the Democratic Party was, yes, for the continuation of slavery, but it was also for a more competitive financial system and for all white men having the right to vote. So if you see it only as a part of slavery, it's hard to understand why they got the votes of a lot of people in the North who only support slavery because they thought that if slavery was abolished, slaves might come north. But their main reason for supporting the Democrats, people, workers in New York City, for example, the main reason for supporting Democrats was not because of slavery. The main reason for supporting Democrats was because they thought Andrew Jackson was a man of the common people and wanted to bring about a fairer economy for them. So I think Brent is half right, but the other half matters too.
Thank you. This question now from Eleanor Sargison, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, class of 23 from Northfield. In your article, Whatever Happened to Moral Capitalism, you mention a possible solution to the modern failings of capitalism, where Democrats need to unite to form an electoral strategy to follow in order to form a decent society. What do you think are the possible challenges and obstacles in this solution, and what, in your opinion, are some of the reasons this has not been achieved by now?
Great question. We talked about some of that before, but this is a very diverse country in lots of ways, right? And the promise of a broad universalist program for benefits for large majority of the people, and more progressive taxation, is very great, I think. But the people have lots of reasons to oppose it. They can oppose it because they don't trust the government to do anything right. They can oppose it because they don't want programs which will help undocumented immigrants or people of a different race from them. They can oppose it because they think it won't work. They can oppose it because they think it's too expensive. Americans, even though we have a pretty big central government and there's a lot of government programs, almost everybody in this society is helped by one government program or another. Sometimes people aren't even aware that they're helped by it. Every time you go to a national park, that's a government program. Every time you get a loan from the Small Business Administration, or you get Social Security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, Medicaid, so forth and so on. You're helped by a government program, but Americans in general, don't really believe that government helping them is a good thing, and that's a real barrier for Democrats. There was a small period of time, 1930s up until the 1970s, where in polls showed that Americans trusted the government to do the right thing most of the time. And we don't have polls before that because public opinion business didn't really begin in a serious way until the 1930s. But since the 1970s, the polls have been just the other way. Since the 1970s, more Americans have been cynical, skeptical about whether the government can help them or not than before. So you had this win. This in the 30s to 70s is what historians call the New Deal order, because it's when most of what we think of as the American welfare state was built. Not all of it, but the foundations of it were built. And the problem is that was that the exception? Can you have another kind of New Deal, whether it's a Green New Deal or just a regular New Deal? A lot of that depends on Democrats convincing people that government can do things for them again that they want. And that's one of the reasons I think we talked about what happened in Virginia yesterday and the close election in New Jersey. One of the reasons I think Republicans did much better than a lot of people expected is because Democrats didn't convince those swing voters who make a difference in elections that the government was really going to do things for them. And also Democrats often talk about the government the way conservatives do, that it's something apart from you. Government is us. We pay taxes to it. A lot of people work for government. You get things from government. So I think Democrats should talk about the government being us much more than they actually do, and that might help make people a little more friendly to it.
Thank you, Michael. A related question from Ethan Ormerod, class of 2022 from St. Olaf. Do you see the Democratic Party moving back to moral capitalism in the near future? Is there a way President Biden can bring it back, or does this kind of change require a new candidate that can inspire more voters?
Well, of course, as we know, Biden was nominated as sort of the best of what a lot of Democrats thought was not a great group. Or at least he was a consensus candidate, not one that people were tremendously excited by, the way a lot of people were excited by Barack Obama, at least in 2008. I must admit, among others. But I think the original Build Back Better, terrible name, but budget of the 3.5 trillion one is really a example, I think, of moral capitalism in many ways. It lots of programs that help the large majority and be paid for primarily by richer Americans. It's a very good example of moral capitalism. But we know, as I mentioned before, a lot of the reasons why it's in trouble and may not pass in any form, but certainly won't pass in the form that Biden and his supporters would have wanted it to pass. Or by any means, a much larger, more expensive bill that would have included free community college, for example, much more expanded Medicare that Bernie Sanders and other progressive Democrats wanted to support. I think sometimes we emphasize too much the power of personality in politics. I think it matters. I think Biden is not a sort of take charge guy. He's in many ways the anti-Trump as a politician. He seems to have, of course he has ego, but he seems to be against being flamboyant. I think he tries to tell the truth as he sees it, though all politicians lie to some degree. But he's not Franklin Roosevelt. He's not John Kennedy. He's not a sort of charismatic figure who can sort of win people over, woo people over emotionally. He's got to make arguments and be trustworthy. And to the degree he can do that, and again, Democrats can mobilize their incredibly narrow majorities. But I hate to say this as a Democrat as well as as an historian, I think it's unlikely because I think at this point it's very likely that the Republicans will win control of the House in 2022, and maybe the Senate as well. We'll have to see. And if that happens, well, we'll be in a situation that Bill Clinton was in 1995. After Republicans took the House of Representatives under Newt Gingrich, that Obama was in 2010 after the Republicans won 63 seats in the House and took back control of the House of Representatives. And we'll be in a position we've been in a lot for the last 40 or so years, where two parties offset each other. No party can really be dominant for very long. And as a result, the problems we have in this society keep festering. And that would be a tragedy, I think.
In your assessment of Biden as a less than fully charismatic candidate, you mentioned as a kind of contrast John Kennedy. But as I'm recalling in various parts of the book, am I recalling correctly that you were critical of the enthusiasm for Kennedy?
Well, when I was 12 years old, I campaigned for Kennedy in my hometown of New Jersey with a big, huge button on, Kennedy Johnson button on my jacket. I had to wear a jacket. It was a private school. I had to wear a jacket to school. Well, I did write an article for the New York Review of Books last spring, which I think the title I gave was Ending the Kennedy Romance. The problem with the Kennedy romance, and it certainly is a romance, and astonishingly, excuse me, it's now almost 60 years after his assassination. There's a lot of people out there who still, sort of long for Kennedy in a sense. The problem with that, of course, is it obscures what he actually accomplished and what he really wanted to accomplish. For example, it wasn't until June 1963, only 5 months before he was assassinated, that Kennedy finally gave a speech to the country and said, "We need a civil rights bill." A really far-reaching civil rights bill, not the kind of sort of watered-down civil rights bills that had been passed when Dwight Eisenhower was president a few years before. And without, the fact that he was killed as he was moving to the left, as he was becoming a more progressive president, I think that's part, at least for liberals, and progressives, that's part of the romance as well. Cut down just as he was about to fulfill his great potential. But as an historian, I have to evaluate who he was when he was alive and what he actually did. And again, he was a politician and a very good one. And he didn't want to alienate the white South until he felt there was no choice. Because he gave a speech in June 11th, 1963, after a lot of Americans had seen teenagers cut down by high pressure water hoses on the streets of Birmingham, Alabama, and had German Shepherd police dogs sicked at them, tearing away their clothing. Demonstrations led by Martin Luther King Jr. in April and May 1963. And this really changed the view of a lot of white Americans in the North about the civil rights movement, made them much more favorable towards it because they saw civil rights demonstrators as being unfairly persecuted and violence being used against them. They were unarmed and they were children too, the ones who were the main part of that demonstration. So that is what convinced Kennedy primarily that now was time to support a civil rights bill because his pollsters told him that that civil rights was becoming more popular among whites, who of course were the overwhelming majority of voters.
Thanks, Michael. This question from Andrew Decker, class of 2023. If moral capitalism relies on policies, programs, and institutions that are moral, in quotations, who gets to define morality? Is it a slippery slope to allow morality to be defined from a single angle, like by a managerial elite or a populous majority?
Right. Well, great question. Well, obviously, I define moral as making capitalism, fairer and more egalitarian. Though it'll never be completely egalitarian, because that would be a form of socialism, which most Americans are not for, and I'm not even sure would ever be possible. um, some kinds of inequality, I think, are probably baked into human societies, exist in every human society. But I think it would be more moral for all children to have enough to eat, for all Americans to have health care, for all Americans to have decent wages, so they don't have to worry about going hungry, for Americans to be guaranteed a job, if they're able to have one. It's just moral capitalism, I think, is what in Europe, European history is called social democracy. But that's not a term that's ever caught on in this country. And of course, Democrats themselves have not used that term. So I wouldn't want to, use that term to define this. But in effect, especially in the 20th century, that is what I'm talking about. And now that's what I'm talking about as well. So for me, morality is something, which helps the great majority without hurting the minority in any particular way. So in that sense, this would be a point of view which was not supported by the managerial elite throughout American history, not supported by the heads of the Second Bank of the United States, or by the DuPont Corporation, which opposed the New Deal, not supported by conservatives now, for example, who, even those like Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and Josh Hawley, who say they want to be the working class party. So yes, of course, that's my definition of morality within a political and economic system. I think morality is helping the great majority to live a better life, and I think it's been proven historically that that can happen better with a larger government presence in people's lives. It doesn't coerce them, but makes certain opportunities available to them, which otherwise would not be available, like having health care or having the right to organize a union without being fired.
Thank you, Michael. This question from Zoe G, senior class, St. Olaf. How do the ideals it gets back to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, how do the ideals of the original Democrats relate to the concept of moral capitalism? Were the original Democrats aware of their hypocrisy in excluding African American settlers and slaves and supporting slavery?
Well, most Democrats used to think the original Democrat was Thomas Jefferson, and for a long time, there were Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners that the Democrats used to have, all the way up until the 1970s and 80s, actually, fundraising dinners. And Jefferson, as you probably know, even though, of course, he was a slave owner, thought slavery was unjust, and looked forward to the time when slavery would be abolished. He didn't do it himself, he wouldn't be the first powerful hypocrite in American life. But he did believe in universal white manhood suffrage. He did, support the rights of white workers to protest the conditions of work. And he did support something which is not capitalism per se, but he did support religious pluralism. He was the author, as Professor knows, and most of you probably do too, of the Virginia Resolution on Religious Freedom, and so in that sense, he was a slave owner who wanted to be seen as a defender of equality, and of course he wrote the final draft of the Declaration of Independence, which says all men are created equal. So again, to compare him to Jackson in that sense. I think you could say he was a more benign Jackson in a way. He was not involved in hunting down Indians, Native Americans, and killing them in large numbers as Jackson was. But he was an Enlightenment figure who was a supporter of what later on would be called liberalism in the 19th century in many ways. Which evolved religious pluralism, evolved supporting free speech after the Bill of Rights, after all, was put into the Constitution after the Constitutional Convention met in 1987. That's why there are amendments to the Constitution. And it wouldn't have been put there if Jefferson and Madison hadn't pushed it. Jefferson was off in Paris when the Constitution was written, so he didn't have a chance to get it put at the Constitution at the time. So again, if you think about Jefferson as the first Democrat being a horrible slave owner, that's true. If we think about Jefferson as, someone who, was one of the people primarily responsible for having, the Bill of Rights. That's also true. And also someone who I think did, at least say in his words and his writings, supported a much more egalitarian society and did look forward to a time. He said in Notes on Virginia, the only book he ever wrote, he said, I'm paraphrasing here. I don't I don't quote Jefferson from memory very well, but he said that he feared for the United States because God is just. When he talked about slavery, he feared that he wanted some kind of gradual abolition, but of course he never got around to it when he was president.
Thank you, Michael. St. Olaf College, of course, is in the great state of Minnesota. And I'm wondering if you could say a few things about some important Minnesotan figures in the history of the Democratic Party. Hubert Humphrey. What would you like to tell us about Hubert Humphrey?
Yeah, the man who would be president. So, well, Hubert Humphrey, was actually born in South Dakota, not too far away. But he was from a pretty humble background. His father owned a drugstore, small town in rural Minnesota. And he made his way up, and he was one of the founders of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which, of course, is still the formal name, I believe, of the Democratic Party in Minnesota, the DFL. He was very much a New Dealer. He was anti-communist. He didn't like the fact that there were communists, rank-and-file communists, who were trying to become part of the Democratic Party, and so he fought to keep them out of the DFL pretty successfully. So he was a cold warrior, but he also was a very important figure in turning the Democratic Party finally, after over 100 years, to be a party that supported civil rights instead of opposed it. And that happened most prominently and first at the Democratic Convention in 1948 in Philadelphia, where a majority of the party at first didn't want to support a civil rights bill, wanted to stay away from that because they wanted to keep the white South voting Democratic, the Solid South, as it was called at the time. But Humphrey, together with other Northern liberals, come out of World War II, especially thinking that this was a war against fascism, against racism. The Democratic Party had to get on the right side. Also, they knew that the Soviet Union was using American racism against the U.S. in the Cold War, talking to people in Africa and Latin America and Asia, saying, how can you support the United States? It's a racist country. They talk about freedom and liberty. They don't believe in it. They don't practice it at home. So Humphrey gave a speech at the 1948 convention where he called for the minority plank on civil rights, calling for a civil rights bill to be adopted. And it was such an eloquent speech. You can hear clips from it on YouTube, and of course read it as well online. That a really spontaneous demonstration began afterward, which lasted 20 minutes or so, and it convinced a lot of people from the North who already said, let's shy away from civil rights, to actually support the civil rights plank in the Democratic platform. And that began a process, and it wasn't immediate, unfortunately, began a process where the Democrats became the party much more identified with civil rights, with black rights, with anti-racism than the Republicans. Whereas earlier, at least during Reconstruction, of course, as you probably know, it was the Republican Party, which was the party of Reconstruction and of black rights and black voting, and the Democratic Party, which opposed it. The Democratic Party then was transformed. It was a long process, but a very important part of it was when Humphrey gave his speech in 1948, and then when he was in the Senate, he was elected to the Senate that same year from Minnesota. He was mayor of Minneapolis when he gave that speech. Then as senator, he in 1964, when Lyndon Johnson was president after Kennedy's assassination, Johnson gave Humphrey the job of shepherding the civil rights bill through the Senate, where he knew it would face a filibuster. And Humphrey did that quite successfully. And that's the main reason why Johnson said, okay, Hubert, I'll make you vice president. And then he ran by himself in 1968. And because of his support of the Vietnam War, the Democratic Party was split, and Humphrey, came close to, beating Nixon in the popular vote, but he didn't come close at all to win the electoral vote. And he ran another 2 times for president in 72 and 76, but he didn't really come close to get the nomination either time. I can also talk about Paul Wellstone if we have time, a more recent Democratic senator who I knew a little bit, or Walter Mondale, but I don't know if we want to move on to other questions.
I was going to ask about Eugene McCarthy, but
Oh, Eugene McCarthy. Yes, yes, yes. I actually dated his daughter in college.
Is that right?
Yes, yes. Mary McCarthy was her name. Same name as the famous novelist and essayist. Yes, the only Catholic masses I ever went to were with Mary McCarthy at my dorm in Cambridge. Oh, outside my dorm in Cambridge. Anyway, well, Eugene McCarthy was a very strange politician because he really was a better poet than a politician, I think. But McCarthy ran on an anti-war platform against Lyndon Johnson in 1968. He came close to winning a couple primaries, early primaries, and because he came close to winning those primaries, and because the polls showed that Johnson would be in real trouble of winning the nomination, Johnson pulled out of the race at the end of March 1968. And but unfortunately, you could win the nomination of the Democratic Party then, and Republican Party too, without running in a single primary. So Hubert Humphrey won the nomination in '68 without running in a single primary, because it was the bosses, the state bosses, who chose the delegates back then. And Humphrey had the boss on his side because Lyndon Johnson wanted Humphrey to be the nominee, not McCarthy, because McCarthy was opposed to Johnson's policy in Vietnam, as was Robert Kennedy, who ran a short campaign for the nomination himself before he was assassinated in early June '68. This is a tragedy of Humphrey in some ways, that he got what he wanted, that is, be vice president, Democratic nomination. But by the time he got there, it wasn't worth very much, because Democratic convention was split wide open in '68 in Chicago, and after that, Humphrey came closer to winning the popular vote than he would have otherwise. But most historians argue that that Democratic convention, the split in the party, made it almost impossible for Humphrey to win.
Michael, your book, the book coming out in the spring, kind of turns, there it is, turns autobiographical around page, at least in manuscript, page 232 or so. You talk about your early origins in the New Left, but you give some impression that you had a conversion experience is too strong, but maybe an adjustment in your political views from those earlier times. You started as a young new leftist, and now you're an advocate of compromise. I mean, would you like to say a little bit about your travels politically?
Sure. I'm not saying I'm an advocate of compromise. I'm an advocate of a program that can make the Democrats the majority party again. So if that involves compromise, fine. But I think it involves standing for something really important and which could be transformative. A program for social democracy or moral capitalism. So in that sense, I would like a program more like the program that Bernie Sanders put forth in his two campaigns for the presidency. Though it would probably have to be scaled back to some degree. But I'm much more on his side, than I am on the side of the moderates in terms of what I want, to happen. Well, what happened? Well, I was always a Democrat until the late '60s, when I was a self-conscious revolutionary. I was so mad at the Vietnam War. Like 1968, I was one of the people who led a SDS march to the State House in Boston with the slogan, "Vote with your feet, vote in the streets." In effect, telling people not to vote because the whole system was irredeemably corrupt. But then in 1972, I was out there canvassing in Portland, Oregon, where I lived, for George McGovern, because I realized that America is not a country ripe for revolution. It wasn't then. It certainly isn't now. And to make changes in the system, you have to work within the system. You have to pressure from without as well. Social movements, whether anti-war movements, labor movement, Black Lives Matter, the feminist movement, LGBTQ movement, are very vital in pressuring people inside, but you have to have an inside-outside strategy. So I've written a book on the history of the American left, for example, American Dreamers, which talks about that to some degree. But with this book and in my own political activity, I've tried to sort of straddle the two, be involved in editing a social democratic magazine, Dissent magazine, for 9 years and more than 11 years, and writing for it. And I write for The Nation and other left-wing publications. At the same time, trying to figure out historically and also now, how Democrats can have a strategy and tactics and a message that can attract a majority. And so, to me, that is really the key question. If you're going to be involved in major party politics, if you're only involved in it because you want to sort of shake things up and you're not thinking about how that shakeup can lead to victories, then you're not being serious about being involved in electoral politics. And so that, I think I came to that realization because um, America, I realized by the early 70s, was not going to have a revolution. um, Americans most did believe that capitalism was an okay system, though I think they would have liked it to be a fairer system and do now as well. And and so that led me to think, well, what's the party in a two-party system that is more receptive to ideas about doing that? And I think that was in the 70s, at least, and onward, the Democratic Party, with all its flaws, and still is. So that's why I'm a Democrat with a capital D, but also, a leftist. In the tradition of leftists being realistic about what they can accomplish.
You mentioned Minnesotan Paul Wellstone earlier. Do you think essentially he was on the right track?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. He said, I'm in the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. And of course, he was speaking at a time when a lot of Democrats were self-consciously shying away from labor, self-consciously shying away from a lot more government spending. Democratic Leadership Council, which I talk about in the book, was a pretty powerful part of the party. And Bill Clinton, when he was elected president, was actually a very high official in the Democratic Leadership Council. It was a small group, but it was a really elite group, which, for understandable reasons, wanted to put forth a program which they thought could win over Americans who they thought were much more conservative than they had been in the 1950s and 60s. And Bill Clinton was very much a creature of that way of thinking about politics, that we have to be more conservative to win power again. And once we win power again, then maybe we can, adopt some more progressive measures. But we have to win first.
And you are, I'm sorry, you are in the spirit of Clinton on that matter?
Well,
I mean, that surprises me a little bit, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, it's always dangerous to ask an historian to compare themselves to someone, an earlier period.
Sure.
I mean, Clinton had his own context and his own problems. I mean, I supported him because I thought he could win, but I was critical of a lot of things he was doing. And of course, as you remember, but students watching do not. I mean, Clinton had a national health care plan before Obamacare, and it involved an employer mandate. It would have had employers, would have had to pay into a national health plan, and it was run by Hillary Clinton. Actually, that plan, at least the program, the strategy to put the plan forward, and it was defeated by a very effective strategy by health insurance companies and small businesses. And the United Republican opposition at the time. It was after what was called Hillary Care was defeated. In fact, it never even came up for vote. The strategy against it was so effective that Bill Clinton began to be the much more sort of moderate, centrist, some would argue, neoliberal figure that we remember him as. He was trying to do one very big thing, institute national health insurance, which was not something which a lot of managerial, people wanted done at the time. But he lost that battle, and the Democrats lost control of Congress. It's called the House of Representatives in 1994, and that is what led him to be a more conservative, to lead a more conservative politics in the last year of his first term and then in his second term.
Thanks, Michael. We're getting close to the end of our time. I'm wondering, is there anything that you would like to talk about that we haven't talked about that your book addresses, or some of the articles that relate to the themes that we've been talking about address?
Not really. Your questions have been great, Professor Santuri, and the student questions are great. They really get to the heart of what I'm getting at. And I think I mentioned this in the introduction to the book. I wrote the book, with my eyes open about all the flaws historically in the Democratic Party and all the flaws in it now. But maybe it's my age that my idealism is tempered with a certain sense of sobriety. I mean, psychologically. I enjoy a glass of wine, but sometimes two. But a sense that we are in, especially now, in very dangerous times in many ways. Climate change, tremendous, of course, divisions in the population, a racial justice movement which is stalled, in some ways met a very powerful backlash. And I think to talk about what we would like ideally is important. Our visions are important, but it's also important to figure out how we can translate those ideals into a winning strategy. That's what politics at its best is, I think. And we shouldn't be ashamed of pursuing that path, because that's the path to actually making change that could be enduring change. As Democrats, for all their flaws, made enduring change when Woodrow Wilson was president, when Franklin Roosevelt was president, when John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were president. Maybe when Barack Obama was president too, with Obamacare, we'll have to see. But we have to figure out, not to, and to do that, one has to be involved, I think, in the party. And that's the other part of it. If you're not in the arena, as Theodore Roosevelt, who was not a Democrat, put it, one of his famous speeches, then you become a spectator to history. And we shouldn't be spectators to history. We should be participants in making the change that's absolutely necessary in this country and in the world. So that's my rhetorical finale, so to speak.
Nicely done. Thank you.
Thank you.
We are now at the end of our time. Thanks to the audience for joining us tonight in this stimulating exchange with Michael Kazin, Professor of History at Georgetown University. And thanks so much to you, Michael, for being with us and for sharing your views on moral capitalism and the Democratic Party.
Thank you.
This event tonight is the last in our series of public events this fall on the theme Capitalism, Freedom, and Community, sponsored by the St. Olaf College Institute for Freedom and Community. Video recordings of all these events are archived on the Institute's webpage at institute.stolaf.edu. That's institute.stolaf.edu. You can also check the Institute webpage for information about forthcoming Institute events. We hope you can join us for these events. But for now, good night, be safe, and be well.